My article is on open hardware, and the research team used Thales Experience with RISC-V. So what the research team did was they used Thales Experience joining the RISC-V ecosystem to propose 7 adoption factors that other firms can use when considering the use of open hardware. So just as a quick background, up until mid-2010, general purpose processors, CPUs, progressed continually and generally could support computing and mobile applications. But at that point, mid-2010, these processors could no longer support all the emerging needs of the consumer IoT, the industrial IoT, and the automotive sector, for example. Those sectors needed simpler, faster, and lower powered processors. In addition to this, development costs started rising quickly at the time when these types of companies needed low-cost custom purpose processors. So what happened was companies started turning to foundations and hardware such as RISC-V, which is an open source solution to create customer purpose processors. And they were joining the RISC-V ecosystem to achieve their objectives. So this is a slide from the RISC website, and it shows the RISC-V ecosystem, which we can go into more detail later. So just very quickly, the research team defined an ecosystem a little differently than we did during our module. They quoted Adner. An ecosystem comprises of heterogeneous but interdependent organizations that combine complementary products and or services to innovate and deliver a value proposition. So for example, companies and organizations and even individuals that come together to support an open source software project or hardware project can form an ecosystem. So what now is open source? So open source involves making bodies of original material, such as code for software, or maybe design CAD files, for example, for hardware, publicly available for others to use usually without a fee. It originated with the free software movement in the 1980s that aimed to make the source code for software available so it could be freely used, copied, distributed, studied, and modified. So the research team coined the term hardware-rich open source ecosystem, or HROS. And they use this term to describe an ecosystem that includes software, both software and hardware components. They gave examples of HROSs. So we'll discuss RISC-V. That's the main topic of this article. But for example, the Open Compute project has Facebook, IBM, and Microsoft as some of its members, and open sources the hardware and software components of data centers. So we can see in this slide that there are big players like Facebook, Alibaba, and Microsoft that have joined multiple HROSs, showing that these big firms see the benefit in open source and in HROSs. So now we'll go to RISC-V. RISC-V, again, is an HROS that we are concentrating on. It has open sourced the instruction set architecture, or the ISA, which is the interface between software and hardware within a processor. This means that unlike most other ISA designs, it is provided under an open source license that does not require fees for use. So it's a big deal for a company like Thales. Currently, the main providers of ISAs are ARM. It's actually the largest provider of ISAs, with devices in our mobile phones, IoT, and embedded devices, and Intel. Okay, now the main actor in the case is Thales, which is a French multinational company. They are active in the areas of aerospace, defense, transportation, and security. In early 2018, Thales greenlit a project to assess the benefits and risks of joining the RISC-V ecosystem. So this is what the research team used as a case study. Basically, the team gathered empirical evidence from Thales. They conducted semi-structured interviews. They collected reports, documents, presentations, and emails. And they initially came up with 14 sub-factors for migrating to an open hardware platform, which they initially grouped into 14 main factors. They continued with additional interviews and whittled it down to 7 main adoption factors, and they included 17 adoption advantages and 19 limitations. So these are the 7 adoption factors that the research team came up with, and we'll go through them one by one in the next few slides. So the first factor is total cost optimization, including the cost of accessing innovation. So in general, open source licenses lower intellectual property costs because of the open nature of the software or hardware. And they also reduce design costs by reusing hardware and/or software building blocks. So members of an HROS, by coming together in an ecosystem, they collaborate, pool their creativity, and reduce the resources that is needed to innovate. So for example, with RISC-V, members of the foundation provide RISC-V extensions, design tools, and sometimes even full processors as open source, so freely accessible through online configurators. So in terms of online configurators and design services for processors, this allows companies to create custom purpose processors that reuse existing building blocks, so they don't have to reinvent the wheel. These existing building blocks are available either as open source, freely usable, or as zero-cost IP. So this approach reduces the need for internal development skills and makes RISC-V a cost-effective platform for custom purpose processors. Now, in terms of Thales, the adoption of RISC-V, this factor proved especially relevant. Given the company's focus on custom purpose processors, open source solutions offered lower royalty fees and simplified access to technology compared to proprietary solutions. So we'll see that a reason for that in another factor. Because the Thales Group is active in aerospace, defense, transportation, and security, it has specific needs and has lower production volumes compared to, say, the mobile phone or automotive industries. Now, the research team said that when assessing the opportunity to join an HROS, any company that is considering that needs to consider the total cost impacts of making the change to an HROS on different applications, so throughout your firm. Okay, the second factor is flexible and rapid design process. In general, an HROS can reduce administrative steps and barriers for new development, and we'll see an example with Thales in the next slide. Administrative steps such as signing NDAs and agreeing on intellectual property rights upfront are often a lengthy process. An HROS also provides rapid design and prototyping capabilities thanks to the contributions of the companies and organizations that are members of the ecosystem. So in terms of Thales, it previously could take Thales up to 18 months to sign an NDA with a supplier offering an ISA. And this agreement, which took 18 months, didn't even cover other Thales suppliers that needed to access the code. So by moving to an HROS, they do away with the need for NDAs since the architecture and the technology is open. So now for companies considering joining an HROs, the research team suggests that these companies should inventory their requirements and explore the design and prototyping solutions available within the HROs they're considering, and to consider the broader market dynamics. The third factor that the research team pointed out was stability and modularity. So in general, stability is in terms of quality, reliability, testing, and certification. To ensure stability, the RISC-V ISA code and extensions are frozen, and the RISC-V Foundation actively promotes the use of a single repository. So this prevents forking of the code. RISC-V ecosystem members have released compliance and verification tools to aid in keeping the stability of the system. Now, a modular approach is an advantage, and Michael Cave, who's a senior director of strategic technology at S5, which is a RISC-V solutions partner, says the modular approach is an advantage. With RISC-V, when you create an integrated circuit, you do exactly what you need, which means that it helps to minimize power consumption, streamline the bill of material costs, and optimize board space. So for Thales, the stability and modularity, the cross-functional team was tasked with overseeing the cross-functional team that was tasked with overseeing the decision-making process identified several promising positive factors. So, like I said before, the RISC-V ISA is code and extension is frozen, and there's a single repository. So for companies that are considering joining an HROs, the research team suggests assessing whether central contributors in the ecosystem can and will address stability and quality issues. And in the case of RISC-V, that was the case. The fourth factor was a white box approach. So in general, an open source approach provides full access to the code and design files, which creates a white box as opposed to a black box, which allows the inspection of the software and hardware. White box approach can help address safety and security concerns and help prevent potential IP infringement because you're seeing the entire system. However, having access to the code is only valuable if the code is properly and systematically inspected. So for Thales, the RISC-V code is accessible to it, and its clients and suppliers are able to also fully inspect it. So suppliers of proprietary solutions are normally reluctant to grant access to their code because it's proprietary, it's closed code. And when they do agree to this, the costs are usually high. So for Thales, the white box approach is critical for open source applications in the aerospace and defense sectors, where security and safety are critical performance factors. So even when they were using proprietary processors, they needed to see the code, which is not a problem with RISC-V. The fifth factor is the ability to select suppliers other than the dominant players. So in general, when you're going with a proprietary solution, you're normally relying on a single supplier, which creates a risk of dependency that can leave companies vulnerable to price increases or limited access to alternative solutions. So an HROs can minimize these risks by offering flexibility because it provides access to multiple supply sources. For Thales, relying on a single supplier creates a risk of dependency that can leave companies vulnerable to price increases. Yeah, so it's the same reasoning. For companies considering joining in HROs, they need to consider all the benefits associated with flexibility in the choice of suppliers. Okay, the sixth factor identified was permissive license agreements, and this obviously has to do with it being open source. So in general, this allows companies to create proprietary derivative work out of open source solutions. So RISC-V uses the BSD license. So that's over here on the right-hand side. So it's a permissive license. It permits modification and distribution in compliance with the license, but it does not force the companies to make any derivative code available to other members of the foundation. So that's up to the company itself. Yeah, sorry. So that's what this is saying. So for Thales, it is able to decide if it will open source its own code or keep it proprietary. So for secure code, for security applications, they can keep it proprietary. But for code that they want to include or open source, they can do that in order to continue building the ecosystem. So for companies considering joining an HROS, the research team suggests they must keep in mind that understanding the legal implications of the license used is not enough. With a permissive license agreement, companies must also understand how members are expected to contribute back to the HROs. So contribute back when required and understand all the licensing agreements, even though it's an open source ecosystem. The last factor that the research team identified is a growing and active ecosystem. So in general, this adoption factor builds on three advantages that mutually reinforce each other. First of all, development of a critical mass of adopters in the user side builds upon the development of a critical mass of the developers and the governance rules of the open source community and ecosystem. So these are sort of reinforce each other, and as they grow, as each of them grow, they help in growing the other of the two. So the RISC-V Foundation's growing membership provides credibility and enhances the resources that support RISC-V. Adoption of RISC-V by commercial firms from many sectors signals that solutions could become a dominant design in the future. Okay, so the research team mapped out the 7 factors, and they determined that there were 3 foundational factors. So the 3 foundational factors were the technical solutions stability and modularity. That was the 3rd factor. The development of a growing and active ecosystem, which was the 7th factor, and the use of permissive licenses. So they identified those as foundation factors, and these 3 foundation factors enable, excuse me, the rest of the factors. So they enable a flexible and rapid design process. The foundation factors enable a white box approach, and they enable the ability of selecting suppliers outside dominant players. And all of those allow the total cost optimization. So in terms of themes, for patterns of technological change, when we talked about an ecosystem during our modules, we spoke about the HD TV and the light bulb. And for example, with the HD TV, it didn't gain traction until high-definition cameras, new broadcast standards, and updated production standards were created. Here, though, they describe the ecosystem as a collection of not just individuals and organizations and companies that work in conjunction to grow that ecosystem. And ecosystem was one of the, a growing and active ecosystem was one of the factors that the research team identified. So within acquisition, the theme of acquisition, so prior, the companies would use internal research and development, but by using open innovation and going to a HROS, these companies benefit from the cross-pollination, not just internally, but benefit from the ideas of being a member of that HROS. So I would consider an HROS here as something like an open innovation alliance, similar to what was in the case about the industry laggards in the automotive industry. And in terms of exploitation, so we Thales is taking the open source software and hardware that's available to the foundation members, and they are commercializing it. And they are taking, so when they take that, they are using the absorptive capacity. They're taking the technology and transferring it internally with the absorptive capacity. And when they are sharing their code and any modifications that they can share, then they're using the disruptive capacity. So next, in terms of the theme of identification, the main point that was in the case is differentiation. So most profitable strategies are built on differentiation. So here, whereas before most companies would either develop internally when they could, or go to a commercial provider of processors. Now these HROSs like RISC-V are able to provide free and open source software and hardware design. So that's a very big differentiation, which is very beneficial to firms. And the theme of protection, so obviously, because it's open source, there's no need really for IP. And again, we talked about the permissive licenses that RISC-V uses. And in terms of selection, the theme of selection, obviously the framework that was built by the research team, the 7 factors that companies can use if they're considering going into open hardware is basically the output of the article. The research team presents a framework. Okay. Thank you very much.